I would once again like to thank the English Bonner Mitchell Foundation for their continuing support, 13 years of continuing support for the Omnibus Lecture Series and for this community. We're, of course, also grateful to our media sponsors, Wayne TV, News Channel 15, and Northeast Indiana Public Radio, who are also continuing sponsors. But in addition tonight, we have a special media sponsor and the sponsor of this particular lecture, Fort Wayne Newspapers. And Michael Chrisman, the CEO of Fort Wayne Newspapers, will be introducing Mr. Bernstein tonight.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mike Chrisman, CEO of Fort Wayne Newspapers and publisher of the News Sentinel. I have only a short time to say something about our speaker tonight, and there are so many things to say. Every generation has its defining moment. For many of us, baby boomers, it was a little break-in at an apartment building in Washington, D.C. that grew to become one of the biggest political scandals in history. Every defining moment is recorded in many different ways. But there is always one seminal work that stands out. In this case, it was the reporting and eventual book written by two newspaper reporters, All the President's Men by Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. It is my great pleasure and distinct honor on behalf of Fort Wayne Newspapers to introduce to you Pulitzer Prize winner, investigative reporter, contributing editor to Vanity Fair, and author of several books, including his latest, A Woman in Charge, The Life of Hillary Rodham Clinton, Mr. Carl Bernstein.
Thank you so much. It is so good to be back in Fort Wayne and in this beautiful, beautiful hall. I was in Fort Wayne about 4 years ago and spoke at a synagogue here, and I heard about this wonderful institution, but this is really the first time that I've gotten to see it and meet its students and its faculty and learn what a remarkable program and facility has been built here, especially in the last dozen or so years, at this wonderful university. As I sometimes do, I decided about half an hour ago to pretty much throw away all the remarks that I thought I was going to give, because one, I've had a really fascinating day, partly because I spent the afternoon meeting with a group of students from this university who asked me a series of questions about journalism, about the political process that got me thinking along some different lines than I had been. And I was also able to ask them a few questions. And also, I'm in the middle of a media tour for my new book about Hillary Rodham Clinton. And I began the morning, and I've been in the Midwest for about the last 2 weeks, being interviewed, appearing on television, speaking before groups about the book. But as often happens when I'm traveling, I start thinking about the people of the country. And one of the great things that's happened to Bob Woodward and myself in the 30-something years since we covered Watergate is that, unlike most journalists who are stuck in Washington or stuck in New York or stuck on the coast or stuck in their newspaper headquarters, we have gotten to travel throughout this country and really get to see the country and talk to its people and learn about the country in a way that few of our colleagues have, I think. And it has been the greatest opportunity, I think, in my life to inform me about what I do and the importance of what it is I do, but also always keeping in mind who it is I'm addressing and how wonderful the people of this country are, and perhaps even more so in some ways in the cliched heartland of the country, because there are some regional differences even today among us, and a kind of earnestness, I think, in this part of the country that sometimes on the East Coast and in the bigger cities particularly we don't get, and a almost desperate desire, I believe, for truth. So I decided tonight what I want to talk about is what I believe good journalism, good reporting, good biography, and the real necessity we have in this country today, and where we perhaps have been going astray in my profession to the great detriment of the country, and that is to talk about what good reporting journalism really is, the best obtainable version of the truth. And it's a simple phrase, but it is very difficult to attain. How many of you all have seen the movie of All the President's Men or written the book? Well, I think that book and movie really illustrate the concept of the best obtainable version of the truth. The movie is really, and the book, not really about Bob and myself and our personal lives. It's about the process of reporting. And what do you see in that movie? You see a desire to learn the facts. You see persistence. You see common sense. You see real respect, I think, that these two reporters have for the people whom they are covering and interviewing, and respect for the truth. You see a desire to understand the context of what it is they're learning and to fit the pieces together. You see a desire on the part of the reporters and a commitment by a great journalistic institution to not being intimidated, even when the leader of the free world gets up every day and he and the men around him attack and question the honesty of the reporters, of the institution, accuse it of being politically biased, and yet you see the principles of that institution, a great editor, a great publisher who you never actually see in the movie, but you hear references to her, never wavering in their support of these two young reporters, very different from most of their colleagues with more experience in Washington, who have bought into and accepted the notion of the regularity and benign nature of someone who happens to be the President of the United States. So I thought about that a lot this afternoon when I was speaking with these wonderful students here this afternoon, and about the best obtainable version of the truth, and how that concept needs to be a kind of umbrella over everything that we do in media it's not going to happen, that umbrella is going to protect us, because there are an awful lot of holes in that umbrella, increasingly. And I was reminded of it this morning. I was interviewed for 3 minutes on a network affiliate owned and operated by the network in Chicago, where you would think it would be a sophisticated news operation, one of the biggest media markets in the country. And I first sat on the set and watched this 6:30 a.m. broadcast that precedes the CBS Morning News go through a series of stories that, when I tell you, bore no relationship to anything of any importance to anybody. I'm understating it. And then I watched two people, I wouldn't even want to guess what their salaries are, these two anchors. Set up the interview with me, totally unprepared. Neither had a clue what my book was really about. A book about someone who may be the next president of the United States. A book that has been reviewed very seriously all over America. And I wondered to myself, what the hell am I doing here? To the point at the end of the interview, and when I tell you the questions asked bore no relationship to anything of any importance anywhere, they were just kind of desultory. Is that how you say that word? Professor, somewhere? Yes? Thank you. I was astonished, as well as I finally said, and then there had been only 3 minutes allotted for this amongst all these other important stories that were being talked about in the morning. And when the camera has a clock on it, and when it approached the 3-minute mark, you could see them trying to get me off the set. So I filibustered a little bit. I was a little, and finally, the guy who was the anchor, he took the book. It was out there on the set like that, and he took it like that. And he said, "Well, it's been nice to have you." And I just said, "Well, it's been good to be on your local news." But it was appalling. And you know, I've often talked and written about how bad most local news broadcasts are in this country. And the question I usually ask of audiences like yourself, I mean, in this community, I'll ask the same thing. How many people here think that your local news broadcasts are a real reflection of the life of this community? How many? I'm telling you, in 20 years, 10 hands all over America. How can this be? If our job is the best obtainable version of the truth, and this is where we get the news more than any other source about our communities, what is happening? What do we think? You know, we have a phrase for this local news approach, eyewitness news, blah, 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 blah. We call it in the business, bleed and lead. You know, if there's blood, if there's murder, if there's sensational, if there's the weird, the stupid, the coarse, it's right up there. And if it's something that really concerns the community that's going on in the education system or the recreation system or the business community in a serious way, I want to see that story covered in a serious way, the best obtainable version of the truth in a local news broadcast. So tonight I want to have a conversation back and forth with you about America, about the press, and in the end I'd like to talk about my book about Hillary Clinton, because I think people do want to know about this book and about this woman who may or may not be the next president of the United States. But I'm going to start from a premise flowing from that experience this morning, that for a generation now, you, the viewers, the listeners, the readers, have not been served nearly as well as you deserve to be by my profession or by our political culture or our media culture in general. And yet, there are great exceptions to that. There are some great newspapers in this country. There are some great journalists in this country. The best journalism in the world is probably done and practiced in this country. But it's the exception. It's not the rule. And also that it's not an accident that those local newscasts put on the air what they do, and that so much gossip and sensationalism and manufactured controversy is the staple of our news, because we know people buy it. The consumers are there. And you can't separate what journalists do from the rest of the culture of this country, any more than you can separate also what politicians do from the rest of the country. A great journalist, Leslie Gelb, wrote in the New York Times before he left the press about 20 years ago to head the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. He wrote in his last column, and I quote Les Gelb, "Washington is largely indifferent to truth. Truth has been reduced to a conflict of press releases and a contest of handlers. Truth is judged not by evidence, but by theatrical performances. Truth is fear. Fear of opinion polls, fear of special interests, fear of judging others for fear of being judged, fear of losing power and prestige. Truth has become the acceptance of untruths." End quote. And I ask you, when you think about this election campaign, and you look and listen to the candidates on television, especially, and when you read the coverage and go through the sentences and parse the words of these candidates, ask yourself the question, is this a theatrical performance? Is this fear of opinion polls? Is this fear of special interests? Is this fear of losing power and prestige? Is this the acceptance of untruths, including the stories you're reading and the broadcast you're watching about the words of the candidates? And I think if you use that, each time you listen to Hillary Clinton or Mitt Romney or Fred Thompson or Barack Obama or Rudy Giuliani, am I hearing the best obtainable version of the truth as this candidate knows it to be, or am I hearing a conflict of press releases and a contest of handlers? And I think you're discerning enough to know if you keep that question in front of you, including the performance of the journalists who are in between you and the politicians and presenting that information, have they been taken in by this ethic of Washington in which we are, as Les Gelb said, indifferent to truth, and that truth has been reduced to a conflict of press releases and a contest of handlers? This indifference to truth, it seems to me, has also permeated the country. That we're not, as citizens, as outraged about untruth as we ought to be. But it might also be that we're not as discerning about what truth is or what is true than we ought to be, because we've become so conditioned to untruth. Untruth by politicians, untruth by simplistic, jingoistic candidates and journalists. For some 25 or 30 years, I've been talking about the use and abuse of power, media power, political power, even religious power. My last book was before the Hillary Clinton biography, was a biography of Pope John Paul II. But increasingly, I'm asked about Washington by people in this country as if it's a foreign country. And because I'm born and raised there, though I live in New York now, and I'm a second-generation Washingtonian, I understand the need for a native guide through this thicket of untruth. And meanwhile, in journalism today, too often we limit ourselves more often than the government limits us. God knows the government has plenty of ways of trying to limit us, but we are not willing to do the hard work of good reporting, of searching out the truth, of doing that kind of simple, persistent knocking on doors that you saw in that movie about these two young reporters. Increasingly, we journalists don't have enough courage to give our readers and viewers what we know is real news. Witness this morning in Chicago. Instead, we pander to them, and sometimes even in the best of our broadcasts and newspapers. Over the last 30 years, we've been abdicating our primary function, the best obtainable version of the truth, and allowed our agenda and priorities to become bastardized and dominated by what I called in a cover story that I wrote for the New Republic magazine in 1992, in the infancy of what we are seeing now in terms of this distorted, untruthful milieu. I called it the triumph of idiot culture. And also I would urge you to take a look at my website, carlbernstein.com, when you get a moment. I believe that piece is on the site. Some other pieces I've written for Vanity Fair about the Bush and Nixon administrations, comparing the two, are on there, as well as a long excerpt from A Woman in Charge about Hillary Clinton and religion, taking all the parts of the book that deal with Hillary Clinton and religion and putting them in one piece that I think you'll find very interesting. But today in journalism, we're losing sight of that ideal too often of the best obtainable version of the truth, and in its place, as I said first in that piece in 1992, we're seeing the dominance of a journalistic culture that's being consumed by gossip, by sensationalism, by ideology, by manufactured controversy, by the triumph of the trivial over the significant, by our own timidity in the press, and by a public discourse that we, the press, the politicians, and the people, are allowing to devolve into an unintelligible cacophony of name-calling and simple answers to tough questions and pursuit of the bottom line at the expense of pursuit of the best obtainable version of the truth. Increasingly, the picture of our society that we see in our media is illusionary and delusionary, disconnected from the true context of our lives. As I indicated when I asked you that question about your local news, it's disfigured by celebrity. Paris Hilton, Paris Hilton, Paris Hilton, Paris Hilton. Paris Hilton, Paris Hilton. By celebrity worship, by gossip, by sensationalism, by denial of our society's real conditions, good and bad. And let me just take one example about our real condition, an easy one. In the United States, the most powerful economic power in the world, in the new century, a bridge fell into a river a few months ago, killing a number of people. This was not anomalous. Our infrastructure in this country is in disastrous condition. It is basic to our economic condition in this country. You don't find roads in Western Europe, for the most part, like you find here. Yet, we've come to accept it almost as a kind of untruth. Oh yeah, we're America. We're in good shape. We've got things that work. Well, things aren't working the way they ought to in a country of this kind of economic ability and with a people as motivated as ours are. And meanwhile, think about the cost of this catastrophic war. The human cost, the cost to the way we are viewed in the world, the cost to our infrastructure that gets ignored. How many of the 50 states do you think are operating in the black and have the economic means to meet their educational needs, their health needs, their infrastructural needs, to aid people who can't help themselves? What are our priorities? These are basic questions that we need to be asking, not more Paris Hilton questions on Larry King. It's fine. Look, we have always had idiot culture bubbling beneath the surface, a kind of subculture, and it can be a kind of harmless fun. But if it becomes our dominant culture, or is even in danger of becoming our dominant culture, that in itself is real news. We need to start looking at our real condition. And there's an awful lot in this country that works. And that, too, is part of what we ought to be covering as the best obtainable version of the truth. But this illusional and delusional news menu that we serve up to our readers and viewers increasingly seems to me is an abdication of another responsibility that we have, and that is both in politics and in media, journalism, to serve the public good. How do we serve the public good? It's not about running out and finding stories about people who are doing estimable things and saying we're going to print happy news any more than it's about going out and saying we're going to go out and find disastrous news. It's about finding reality. It's about covering truth, the best obtainable version of the truth. There's a tendency to regard the press as different from other institutions in American culture, but more likely we reflect the larger values of the society itself. When I began work in the newspaper business in 1960, mainstream journalistic culture was rooted in a concept of serving the public good. How? Simply, the bottom line was the best obtainable version of the truth. That ethic infused the newspaper where I went to work in 1960, the Washington Star, a paper that in those days challenged and often surpassed the Washington Post. Newspapers were there to make money for their publishers, no doubt, but they also were there for the bottom line that wasn't financial. The same as perhaps in the medical profession. There was, and one still hopes is, a bottom line that is not merely financial. The most important decision a reporter or a news organization makes is to determine what is news. And the best obtainable version of the truth in today's media atmosphere is increasingly an anachronistic notion. Think about a watershed in American culture, the coverage of the Michael Jackson trial. Around the same time that we went to war in Iraq, and think of the resources that were devoted to the deepest questions about the Michael Jackson trial, the journalistic resources, the amount of airtime, and think about how long it took us to raise the most deep and necessary questions about how we went to war in Iraq. So the overwhelming trends in journalism since Watergate, which is held out as this apogee, this period of the Watergate story, the overwhelming trends in journalism since then have favored not a serious commitment to the best obtainable version of the truth, but rather to the sensational, the coarse, the stupid, the strange, and especially manufactured and over-amplified controversy and overheated debate, as on the old Crossfire show and its mutant offspring. But that debate increasingly also is the same damn debate that our politicians have. How many watched the Republican debate last night? And watch these two jokers go at each other about which one really was the better tax lowerer. What was that about? Except insulting your intelligence, but they know it works. That this is what political debate, particularly the political debate within that party, and this party has got one every bit as idiotic, trust me, is about. And then the stories the following day, all about the atmospherics and the acceptance of the untruth of that basic debate as if it has anything to do with any reality. That is a triumph of idiot culture in politics and journalism. When I talk with students this afternoon, some of whom are here, you can see their desire not to be manipulated, not to be insulted by that kind of debate. And yet, it's become our norm. It's accepted. It's not real. And I think maybe the reason that you asked me here tonight, especially given that this is an educational institution with students who want to know and to learn, does go back to Watergate, not just the work that I've done most recently. Why does Watergate resound 35 years later? Because the system worked in Watergate. And we saw democratic principles succeed in a way that reaffirmed our common belief in the ideas of government that serves its citizens, belief in the rule of law, belief in common sense, belief in not insulting our citizens, belief in media and journalism just doing its job. And we haven't seen that since, vividly and etched so clearly. And in the United States, during the Bush years particularly, we've seen the opposite of the system working. We have seen a systemic failure, a failure of truth over lies, of competence over incompetence, of dealing with a president in the media and within the political system who in many ways has been far more catastrophic for the country or the world than Richard Nixon ever was. And I think, incidentally, you don't have to be a Democrat to believe that. When I talk to Republicans on Capitol Hill, you'd be amazed how many of them have that view. But it's important to see why the system worked in Watergate, to recognize what happened and what didn't happen and what we in the press did and what we didn't do, because there should not be a mythology that holds that the system worked because of the press. The system worked because all of the elements of the system worked. The press did its job. We got to the best obtainable version of the truth because we had, not just at the Washington Post, but also the New York Times, which gave us some pretty stiff competition. And after we had written some early stories by CBS News, the same CBS News, the same company that owns that station where this morning the biggest most important moment in the early part of the Watergate story in terms of presenting it to the American people in a credible way was when Walter Cronkite, in October of 1972, 4 months after we at the Post started writing these stories, devoted 3/4 of 2 whole evening news broadcasts to the Watergate story, which until then most people didn't believe or didn't really know about or weren't really taking into their consciousness. But the CBS News took those stories we had written and devoted a majority of their broadcast. And when the President of the United States had his aide call Bill Paley, who owned CBS, and threatened to take away the licenses of some of its owned and operated stations, the same way that the White House had tried to take away the licenses, the broadcast licenses of the Washington Post as a threat in Watergate. CBS resisted. It went ahead and with those stories. The Washington Post resisted. I'm not sure that would happen today at CBS. I know it would happen at the Washington Post because the ownership remains in the same family. And the Washington Post and the New York Times are the only great newspapers left today owned independently by a family rather than these conglomerates. But why did the system work? Not just because of those stories, but then a great judge decided, on the basis of what he had read in our stories, to apply pressure to the Watergate conspirators. And then a great senator chaired hearings into the conduct of the White House. And Republicans and Democrats on that committee followed the facts and the truth wherever it took them. And then the House of Representatives voted to create a committee on whether or not the President of the United States should be impeached. Articles of impeachment were voted, and the key votes were cast by members of the Republican Party who were under great pressure from the White House not to vote for those articles. And then what happened in the system? The Supreme Court of the United States unanimously decided that the president was not above the law and he had to give up his tapes. And the Chief Justice had been appointed by Richard Nixon. And the Chief Justice did not meet the expectations of the White House that he would fall into line and decide in favor of his patron. But instead, the Chief Justice of the United States and all of the other justices voted unanimously because they thought it was so important for the country to establish that the President of the United States was not above the rule of law. And then, after the articles of impeachment had been voted and it was clear that the House of Representatives, the full House, would vote to impeach the President, and the President vowed to resist, Senator Barry Goldwater, the great Republican conservative, and the Republican leadership of the House and the Senate marched down to the White House and told Richard Nixon that they would vote not just to impeach him, but to convict him in the Senate. And finally, Richard Nixon, who was a criminal president and who had bent the Constitution left office. And his successor said our long national nightmare is over. The system worked. Well, what's happened now? The system has not worked. There are huge differences between the Nixon presidency and this one, of course, but very few would appear to redound to this administration's benefit, including even the fundamental question of competence or truthfulness of this president. The excesses of Watergate, the crimes, the lies, the trampling of the Constitution, the disregard for the institutional integrity of the presidency, the dutiful and even enthusiastic law-breaking of Nixon's apparatchiks stemmed from one aberrant president's psyche and the paranoid assumptions that issued from it, and from the notion shared by some of his White House acolytes that because U.S. troops were fighting a war, especially a failing one against a determined guerrilla enemy in Vietnam, that the commander-in-chief could assume extraordinary powers nowhere assigned in the Constitution and govern above the rule of law. Richard Nixon famously said, and I quote, "When the president does it, that means that it is not illegal." Sound familiar today? It's news. It's not about Democrats or Republicans. It's about what is happening. It is about the best obtainable version of the truth. And the story today is and ought to be, day after day after day, not Paris Hilton, but George Bush, this war and the truthfulness or lack of truthfulness of what Condoleezza Rice says, of what George Bush says, of what Dick Cheney says, of what the former Secretary of Defense said, etc. Because it does not take a genius or a great editor or a great reporter to know how monumental the importance of this story, of this war, and this presidency is. And it has to be covered from the perspective of the best obtainable version of the truth, including the question, why are not photographers permitted to take pictures of the flag-draped caskets returning back to Dover, Delaware? If that is not I'm trying to think of the right adjective, obscene act of censorship by the President of the United States and our acquiescence to it, not that we ought to be just trying to find ways to take those pictures, but the myth that this policy somehow has something to do with the sensibilities of these poor families who have lost their fathers, brothers, sisters, children, and that the country doesn't get to understand in human terms the meaning of this war because the president has decided to censor pictures that would tell us the most basic truth about the war. That is obscene. And the notion that we in the press don't make it part of our agenda to petition to Congress to be given access to that Air Force base is equally outrageous. Every day we should be demanding that we are permitted to take those pictures and not forget about it. Bush and Cheney have hardly been less succinct than Richard Nixon saying when the president does it, it means it's not illegal, about the president's duty and right to assume unprecedented authority nowhere specified in the Constitution. And I quote, Mr. Cheney, especially in the day and age we live in, the President of the United States needs to have his constitutional powers unimpaired, if you will, in terms of the conduct of national security policy. Bush's doctrine of unimpairment, at one with his tendency to trim the truth, may be, with the question of his competence, the nub of our national nightmare today. Quote, I have the authority both from the Constitution and the Congress to undertake this vital program, Bush said after more than a few Republican and conservative eminences said he did not, and joined the chorus of outrage about his NSA domestic surveillance program when it was originally revealed. And let me say that since the early days of the war, the press covering this presidency has done a great job about the coverage of this presidency. Everything we know about this presidency and its excess and its bending of the Constitution and about terror and about Abu Ghraib and about suspending the Geneva Conventions and about torture. But it's not torture if I say it's not torture. We know from the press. We don't know any of this from any truths told in this presidency. We don't know it through congressional oversight because there hasn't been real congressional oversight, including since the Democrats have taken over the Congress. And now, out of fear of opinion polls, fear of acceptance of untruths, it looks like that Democratic majority is going to go along and accept, for the first time in our history, this kind of domestic surveillance. And say, okay, Mr. Bush, it's an election year. It's all right if you do it. Back to what Leslie Gelb said 30 years ago. Truth is the acceptance of untruths. Terrorism is not the only new danger of this era, said George F. Will, the conservative columnist, and I continue to quote George Will. Another is the administration's argument that because the president is commander-in-chief, he is the sole organ for the nation in foreign affairs, which is refuted by the Constitution's plain language, which empowers Congress to ratify treaties, declare war, fund and regulate military forces, and make laws necessary and proper for the execution of all presidential powers. So we now find ourselves knee-deep in this culture of untruth. And part of this culture of untruth is carrying over to the presidential campaign itself. And yet there are hopes, it seems to me, that there also is a demand for truth as we approach a new presidential election. So I want to talk just for a couple minutes about the best obtainable version of the truth and why I wrote this biography of Hillary Clinton called A Woman in Charge. I would suggest, incidentally, that if we had had a real biography the best obtainable version of the truth about George Bush that was meticulously reported, that had taken some of the hints that reporters in Texas had given us about George Bush in the year 2000. I'm not at all sure. In fact, I doubt that if we had had a real biography, that he would have been elected in 2000, Supreme Court or no Supreme Court. But what drew me to the story of Hillary Clinton, and I started work on this book in 1999, almost 8 years ago, and it's one of these cases where my perpetual procrastination paid off. Because I was fascinated by the idea that after the impeachment of Bill Clinton, that the only person whose stature was enhanced was Hillary Clinton. Everybody else involved was diminished immeasurably. The President of the United States, the press that had covered the Lewinsky story so deliciously, the Supreme Court of the United States, which had allowed the Paula Jones case to go forward, an outrageous decision that a sitting President of the United States has got plenty of time to sit there and fight a civil lawsuit that can just as easily have been adjudicated after he left office. The Republicans in Congress who pursued impeachment, the principal ones of whom have left the Congress themselves because of their own hypocrisy. And yet here was Hillary Clinton, who in the first 5 years or so of the Clinton presidency had become truly damaged goods. And yet with her husband's impeachment and her decision after this horrible experience that she had been put through, decided that she would try to redeem her own legacy, that of the Clinton presidency and that of her husband, and not for the first time saved Bill Clinton's political career. And what I did know was that on the day that, and the exact hour that the Senate was voting on the articles of impeachment, whether or not to convict or acquit Bill Clinton, and it was a foregone conclusion that it would vote along party lines to acquit because a 2/3 majority was necessary to convict, and they had only 45 and 50 votes on the two counts. Amazing if you think about it in itself that 45 or 50 members of the U.S. Senate would vote to convict the President of the United States in that instance. But at that moment, while the Chief Justice, wearing robes that he had designed especially for the occasion, based on something he had seen appropriately enough in a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, Hillary Clinton was meeting with her Svengali, Harold Ickes, from the window of her study upstairs in the White House. She could see the Capitol. Downstairs, the president and his aides were glued glumly to the television, watching the vote be tallied. And she was looking at maps of the state of New York with Harold Ickes, and I knew about this, deciding whether or not to run for Senate. Well, it's a fairly audacious moment to pick to be looking at those maps. I would say that's a statement. And lo and behold, despite the predictions of almost all the political pros that it couldn't be pulled off, she ran and won a seat in the United States Senate. Well, what had always struck me was it seemed to me that Hillary Clinton was a great story. And what I found as I decided to do this book and followed the story and talked to some 200 people who had known her best throughout her life, from childhood through the Senate years and into the presidential campaign. Here was the best-known woman in the world, and yet we knew almost nothing about her. As she herself said, I'm a mystery. And partly by choice and design, because she's somebody who, one, has been through an awful lot of unpleasantness in her life, two, is very guarded and very private, three, has a view of herself that often is not what others see at a given moment, which is common among us all. But most important, her story has always been told either by enemies and opponents who have given us caricature, or her acolytes and true believers who have likewise dealt in caricature. And I started to smile here because I did another one of these interviews on television the other day, and I used the word acolyte. And on the web, they put up a story about what I had said on television, and they said, and the word acolyte was there, except it was in quotes, and it went A-C-K-O-L-I-G-H-T. My wife saw it and said, "You're not going to believe this. I told you not to use the word acolyte." A true fact, as they say in my business. But yet, think about your perceptions of Hillary Clinton and what you've seen on television and what you've read. These caricatured views and her own attempt at autobiography or memoir, airbrushed with huge holes in the story, as I discovered, even down to the most basic emotional event of her husband falling in love with another woman in 1989 and deciding he wanted to leave the marriage, as I found out from Betsy Wright, who was Bill Clinton's chief of staff in Arkansas. And Hillary, as Betsy Wright told me, wouldn't give him a pass out of the marriage. Well, one of the things that I learned, the first person I talked to, and the Clintons and I have a lot of mutual friends, and before I decided to do the book, I went to one of them and was told by this person, if you're going to do a book on Hillary, you have to start with her Methodism. And I said, what? I mean, I knew she was Methodist, but it didn't seem to me, hugely important. Well, it turns out that religion and family are really the foundations of the life of Hillary Clinton. Going back to her experiences in a family, as David Broder, the Washington Post political columnist, said in a fascinating column about my book a couple of weeks ago, as he put it, Hillary Rodham's household was every bit as dysfunctional as Bill Clinton's. Her father was a martinet, a sour, unfulfilled man who verbally abused and demeaned and humiliated Hillary's mother. Betsy Ebeling, Hillary's closest childhood friend, who I spent many hours with, told me how she'd be at the dinner table in the Rodham household. And her father, who was misanthropic as well, would throw out a conversation idea almost like a glove on the dinner table, and then as they would start to debate it, Hillary, her brothers, her mother, her father would start to demean her mother and say, "What do you know? How do you know anything, Miss Smarty Pants?" And finally, when her mother would have had enough of this, she'd get up to leave the table and he'd say, "Don't let the screen door hit you in the ass on the way out." And Hillary became conditioned to not wanting to have friends come home. And yet, she felt loved by her father, she said, and wrote in her memoir, tried to please him, as she said, however she could, by bringing good grades home. Her father, she said in that book, was not one to spare the rod. Excessively, she thought, especially in the case of her brothers, were the words she used. She didn't say anything about how often or how she might have been beaten, except for that reference. But her father was a sour, unfulfilled man who had been a drill instructor in World War II and ran his house like a boot camp, shouting orders, barking orders. And yet he did teach Hillary how to play softball, pinochle, helped her with her homework, and interestingly enough, had a view that because she was a girl didn't mean she was precluded from doing anything. You don't have to be the Sopranos shrink to think that maybe growing up in this household, particularly her mother counseling Hillary and her brothers, you don't get divorced in this family, to start to think there are some parallels and some factors that might figure in Hillary's own life and in the decisions she made. This is not a psychobiography, however. It is the story of a woman's life that at every turn is surprising and in total contrast almost to these caricatures that have been given us, these simplistic drawings of black and white, easy, good, bad. And if you take a look at my website, I've put excerpts from the reviews of the book up there, which have really been humbling because the reviewers have really gotten what this book is in saying that it's definitive or the best obtainable version of the truth as we can get now. And so for the first time, we're able to see how this life has been lived and what an extraordinary story it is and what a great tale it is. And we see fear of embarrassment time and time and time again. Fear of humiliation. In her own house as a child, we see it when we look at Whitewater from the inside. What was Whitewater about? Fear of embarrassment. It wasn't about anything illegal. What were the embarrassments? Things that happened back in Arkansas, some financial dealings. The fact that she was a small-town lawyer who probably had engaged in some conflict of interest. Embarrassing, not illegal. And yet, a special prosecutor, out of control, ideologically driven, appointed by the Chief Justice of the United States through two ideological judges who were empowered under an act of Congress to appoint what's called an independent counsel. And these judges, this special panel named by the Chief Justice of the United States, who himself had great animus to the Clintons, Justice Rehnquist. And I spoke at great length with Hillary Clinton's lawyers, some of them on the record, who talk about how, indeed, she was not forthcoming in that investigation, and how she feared, based on what they had advised her, that she might well be indicted. She feared for more than 2 years. Every day she got up wondering if she was going to be indicted. And here she and Bill Clinton had come to Washington. They thought to do all these estimable things, the things they had campaigned for. And 6 months into the presidency, Vince Foster, her great friend, soulmate, had committed suicide, leading her to believe that the culture of Washington was indeed murderous, including the press. And that suicide began this series of investigations, a Pandora's box of embarrassments. What were the so-called missing billing records really about? That her law practice was a nickel-dime law practice, not that of one of the top 100 lawyers in America. The significant legal work she had done was not at the Rose Law Firm. It was as a child advocate and as the head of the, appointed by Jimmy Carter to head the National Legal Services Program, which she actually saved legal services for the poor during the Reagan administration. So the story at all times turns out to be much different than these caricature expectations, including Bill Clinton's women. What's important about Bill Clinton and the other women is that Hillary had to deal with it. That she recognized early in the marriage that here she was married to the greatest political talent of our generation, and that he would not be politically viable if these sexual compulsions, as she termed them, became known, and their effect became known. So she began trying to contain them from knowledge outside the inner circle and covering them up and having women investigated through Betsy Wright and others and hiring lawyers. At one point, a lawsuit was filed by the Clintons' political enemies inferring that Bill Clinton as governor had had a slush fund that paid for entertaining 5 women, and Hillary Clinton had her own law firm hired to defend and represent the 5 women and get affidavits from them that they had never had affairs with Bill Clinton. And she interrogated one of them, and her law partners interrogated the others. Start to think of what, and this became a bigger and bigger part of what she did. So think maybe what that might do to the psyche of a spouse. And meanwhile, the most important aspect of her life was family. And you see her struggling, trying to hold the marriage together under these circumstances. So what I'm getting at is that the story is quite different, and it's a human story. And as the reviews have said, and what we see now is after she ran for the Senate, she had followed Bill Clinton to Arkansas, and there's one line in her own autobiography that is almost a rosebud moment in which she says that she had failed the District of Columbia bar examination. Here's this woman, president of her class at Wellesley, has gotten great national attention as a student leader, goes to the Yale Law School, comes to Washington and works for a congressional committee, and fails her bar exam after Yale Law School, and never tells anybody, with the exception of Bill Clinton, about it, as far as I can tell, for 30 years. I went to Webb Hubbell, her law partner, who went to jail in the Clinton presidency and who knows her as well as anyone. I said, Webb, do you know that Hillary failed the bar exam? He said, it's impossible. Couldn't have happened. Vince didn't know about it. I didn't know about it. I went to Nancy Bekovac, president of Scripps College, the Clintons' closest friend from law school. She was flabbergasted. Fear of embarrassment, humiliation. You can imagine, after all of this attention paid to her as this great, successful woman of her generation, fails the bar exam. I went to get the records of the D.C. bar. 700 people took it on the day she did. Maybe one other Yale Law School graduate failed. She never took it again. She had offers from Washington law firms to go to work for them. Well, she couldn't have gone to work for them except as a paralegal unless she took the exam again, and she didn't. She passed the Arkansas bar exam and followed Bill Clinton to Arkansas. And what you see today, after successfully running for the Senate and in fact redeeming the Clinton legacy that was in tatters when Bill Clinton left office, you see for the first time, when you really know and read and understand her story, you see her coming into her own in the Senate. A terrific senator for the people of New York with a national constituency that no other senator has, and yet she takes almost no important stands on positions of great national issues in her time in the Senate with great passion, as she did in the White House. And in the White House years, she had had this tin ear that surprised so many people, was a clumsy politician, but she was there for Bill Clinton. She was not in charge. And again, the great failure of her life, health care, the greatest failure, I guess, since she had failed the bar exam. And I talked to Donna Shalala, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who had been handpicked by Hillary for that job. And Shalala said to me, Carl, I begged Bill Clinton not to appoint Hillary to be head of health care because she wasn't ready for it yet. She didn't have the experience. And I told him, you can't fire her if she screws up. And Lloyd Bentsen, the Secretary of the Treasury, told me the same thing. And the election of the Newt Gingrich Congress that impeached Bill Clinton, the 1994 tectonic shift, the end of Democratic dominance since Roosevelt of the Congress of the United States, was a direct result of Hillary Clinton's failure at health care and the so-called ethical problems, many of them about these embarrassments, that were attributable not to the president, except that he had appointed her, of course, but to Hillary Clinton. And yet, when she becomes a member of the Senate, wins over those same senators who voted against her husband, makes them believers that she is a terrific senator, regardless of whether they agree or disagree with her, a member of the club, and they respect her. And now we see her, for the first time in her life, with a kind of ease and contentment her friends see that they've never seen before, and a kind of self-confidence that they've never seen. So all I'm getting at and suggesting is that the best obtainable version of the truth about Hillary Clinton And particularly when you also look at her vote on the war, is a very different story than we're conditioned to expect. And through it all is a remarkable human figure, whether you like her more or less when you finish the book. But finally, it's a flesh and blood person, and you see this incredible arc of her life. And as someone said to me in the campaign the other day about what we're watching now, it's the marriage, stupid. Meaning that the Clinton campaign is, to a large extent, a campaign of restoration, of returning Hillary and Bill Clinton to the White House, with her claims of being an agent of change. But it would be a co-presidency in the sense that the first Clinton presidency was the first time the spouse of a president had become the president of the United States. So I'm hoping that tonight you'll pick up a copy of, now I get to the pitch. Believe me, if you don't like it, call me or email me, you can have your money back. I want people to read this book because this woman may be the next president of the United States, and we need to know who she is. We need biography. And I would hope there would be similar books about the other candidates that tell us the real story of their lives and get beyond these caricatures and these acceptance of untruths that have marked so much of our political journalism as well as our political process. So I want to thank you for being here tonight, and how wonderful it is again to be in Fort Wayne. And I'll be outside and sign books for you. And thank you for coming and having me here. Thank you. Thank you. Now, before we do that, let's take about 5-10 minutes and do some questions, because I think it's unfair not to let you have a shot at me. Go ahead.
There's a gut venom that's directed toward her that we haven't seen since FDR. And I'm wondering if you think it might be because she's a smart woman.
Do I think that
that frightens people?
The enmity toward Hillary is because she might be a smart woman who frightens people, and that we haven't seen a candidate with this kind of enmity since FDR. I think that's part of it. I think there are many, many, many reasons for it, for the fact that she is so, to use the cliche of the day, polarizing. One is she has had, as I say in the last chapter of the book, great difficulty with the truth. And I think that she and Bill Clinton have claimed for themselves to be better than other politicians in this regard, and that it is an easy mark for her opponents and her enemies to exploit. I think the fact that Bill Clinton was reelected, the only Democrat to be reelected since Franklin Roosevelt, is a big factor in the enmity toward Hillary Clinton, because as she says, and I'll use her words, we beat the Republican right machine twice. And then when he was impeached and their Republican enemies thought that Clintons and Clintonism were dead, now their worst nightmare, hell on earth, she's running for president. I think that's part of it. I think gender is part of it. I think the fact that in the major portfolio that she had, she performed really badly is part of it. I think there are all kinds of reasons. It's very complicated, and many of them go to this question of women and their view of how she has accepted certain conditions of the marriage. So I don't think there are any easy answers to it. Yes, sir.
I would ask, you would elaborate just a little bit about
Would I comment on stories swept under the rug when big businesses threaten to pull their advertising in the press? I don't think it happens very often. I think it's very seldom that kind of corruption exists in the mainstream press. I think there are. I'm sure you can find examples. I think it's a much more subtle and insidious kind of thing. I think it comes sometimes from a perception that that we're either too liberal or too conservative, but I don't think that threatening to pull advertising is really the source of much of it. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. The question is, it's often said that the internet is now sometimes described as the real ability to get to the truth, and what do I think about the veracity and truthfulness of the web? I think that you can't generalize about the web. I think, first of all, that one of the great things about the web is that you can read the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Haaretz, Al Jazeera, anything you want on the web. It's a shift in consciousness that is as great as anything since the printing press. And so part of the great thing is that all of us have the ability to pursue the best obtainable version of the truth through one source after another that would have taken us years before. It also is totally without any standardization in terms of anybody can put any damn thing up they want on the web, and so you have to be discerning. And one of the good things about the web is that it has shone a light on mainstream media, I think, and given us some scrutiny that we needed, and at the same time it has strewn enough garbage out there that has got and fueled more of this know-nothing debate that goes on in this country that's ideologically driven. And I was thinking about this today, about how much of the reading in this country, books, newspapers, magazine, is about people reading what they already believe. And I think it's a big difference generationally. I was speaking to the students about this. I think it's a big difference generationally that there was much more reading in previous generations for knowledge, not for ammunition. I'm going to close, and again, thank you, but I did want to get a few questions in. I talked a little longer than I expected, but it's been great fun for me, and I hope you've had as much fun as I. And thank you.